I keep thinking of the way the smoke tasted that night. Not like smoke at all, but like stale pennies and old cardboard, with a sour sting that settled in the hollow behind my teeth. I remember telling myself I was being dramatic, that I'd had worse blunts, worse bars, worse nights. I remember the joke, the laugh, the flick of the lighter, the tight pull that made the ember glow. I remember everything until I didn't. I was at a friend's loft on the edge of the city, late enough that the world outside was a shadow-gloss smear of neon and rain. We had been talking about nothing for hours. Music, bad exes, a half-remembered film, and someone produced a joint like a prop. The room smelled like beer and incense and the leftover smell of winter coats. We passed it around, casual, a small orbit of people who had known each other long enough to be comfortable and not quite long enough to be invisible. I took my turn and, as always, watched the smoke curl like a promise across the low lamplight. It went down easy at first. Maybe that made it worse. The first sign that something was wrong was the cottonmouth. Sudden, furious, instant. My tongue swelled in my mouth like foam at the lip of a broken machine. I reached for my water and knocked it over. No elegant, slow spill, it arced and vanished on the rug like it had been swallowed. People laughed. Someone asked if I was all right. I remember smiling, the kind of smile you give when the shape of your face is unfamiliar. Heat moved through me like a current. My skin prickled. My heart was doing things it had no right to do, skipping, pounding, then nothing. I tried to speak, and my mouth produced a handful of slurred sounds that were not words, like a radio tuned between stations. Time began to unspool, not the poetic, cinematic kind of slow, but a viscous, treacherous time that congealed into lumps I could not step over. Clocks on the wall elongated until the numbers were worms. The hands fused together and then spun, backward like a film rewinding. The lamp's light grew horns and then withdrew. The faces around me, my friends' faces, stretched and melted like wax, features collapsing into other things. Eyes became black olives, mouths became empty doorways. I blinked and found my lids sticking briefly, as if threads had been sewn into them. Someone, maybe Maya, was asking if I needed to sit down. Her voice was a distant record, full of warble and tremble, and the words came through as subtitles I could not make sense of. When I tried to stand, my legs refused. Sensation and agency had divorced. I was a spectator in my own muscles. My hands felt enormous and weightless at once, like I was wearing gloves made of cloud. I remember looking at my fingers and being certain, with the absolute conviction of a prophet, that they were not mine, that they belonged to someone older, someone who had lived a dozen lives I had not. The hallucinations were not the prettified, manufactured visions people sometimes boast about. They were slow-motion betrayals. The apartment around me rearranged itself into a theology of menace, the couch becoming a harbor for things that breathed, the ceiling drawing closer like an enormous listening face. Mirrors were worst. I found myself drawn to a small, cracked mirror propped against a bookcase. I watched my reflection approach from inside the glass. Not a mimic, but a being that moved with intent separate from me. It smiled before I did. It licked its lips. It mouthed words that I could feel thrumming inside my skull, but when I peered more closely, the mouth was not a mouth at all, but an entrance to a black corridor. For a while I forgot that mirrors reflect. In my head, the mirror was a thing that wanted to be stepped through. Every object acquired a personality and a hunger. A coat hook took on the manner of a stern old man. A lamp quivered like a small animal. The coffee table seemed to pulse with a heartbeat that matched mine. Shadows lengthened and pooled. They conspired in corners. I could see the threads of memory unwinding from the people in my life. Frayed, yellowing ribbon-like things that trailed from their shoulders. I reached timidly for one of the ribbons that trailed from Eli, who was trying to be useful and looked more like a mannequin at a thrift store. My fingers closed on it and my hand came away sticky. I tasted that stickiness, copper and the metallic tang of regret. Speech turned traitor next. Language collapsed into riddles and then into nothing at all. Sentences were slippery fish. I thought I could feel the shape of them, the weight of a thought, but before I could secure it with my tongue, it dissolved into cold air. I tried to tell Maya I needed help. I tried to form the words like slow beads on a string. The string snapped. She said my name and it slid past like someone calling out a different city. She got up. Someone called an ambulance. The word ambulance echoed like a chorus of glass. I wanted to tell them it was unnecessary, that I was fine, that it would pass. But the thought that it would pass was itself a thing slipping from me. A comforting belief unspooling. The physical symptoms writhed under the psychological ones. My vision doubled, then tripled. There were after-images, frames of myself bleeding into each other with micro-interval delays that made me dizzy. My body fluctuated between being hot enough to melt into the floor and cold enough that my teeth chattered in silence. My mouth was so dry I could not make saliva. My cheeks pulled inward like a puppet whose strings had been cut. I could not swallow. When panic arrived, it did so like a tidal wave with a fine metallic flavor. I could feel each pulse of blood as if a second heart had been grafted to my throat. And the fear, God, the fear, the catastrophic certainty that something else was inside me, moving, speaking, cataloging. It wasn't so much a voice as a presence, a geometry of thought, invasive, clever, amused. I had the thought, a thought that did not belong to me, that the walls were remembering my sins, and that the room wanted to teach me a lesson. The more I resisted, the more elaborate the lesson became. Shadows took to whispering names I had not said aloud in years. They catalogued cruelties, small and large, and played them back as movie reels. Humiliations from high school, the time I abandoned a friend on a road trip, conversations where I had nodded instead of being honest. They magnified trivial wrongs into monstrous torments, turning guilt into a palpable clawing at the inside of my chest. I do not remember the exact sequence of hours. Memory after that night is more like a patchwork quilt, stitched by hands that tremble. I recall being in a hospital at one point, fluorescent lights like faint suns, nurses who felt like statues. But I also remember being in the back seat of a car that had turned into a moving cave, the asphalt below pulsing like the belly of a beast. I remember someone pressing a damp towel to my forehead, and it felt like they were laying a map across my skull. In seconds that should have been hours, I encountered entire landscapes, deserts of white sand where I wandered barefoot, only to discover the sand was made of teeth, a library in which every book contained a future I had not chosen, a house of mirrors in which the reflections fought for their place in the world. Each scene was not only seen but inhabited. My body was stretched thin, a thread connecting them all. At the worst point, reality and hallucination braided into an indistinguishable single thing. My own face strobed in and out of existence as if someone were flicking a lamp on and off inside me. Every time it went out, I felt like something else stepped forward and looked back. I crawled, and my palms found the rug and left prints that smelled like another life. I spoke, and my voice came out as my mother's voice. I thought I saw the ceiling rise like a lid, and there, pressed against it, was a face. Ancient, cracked porcelain that seemed to grin with an expression that was both sorrow and appetite. I tried to count to steady myself. 1, 2, 3. Numbers dissolved into textures. 1 became the roughness of an old sweater. 2 was a certain timbre of a saxophone in a song I loved. 3 tasted like pennies and the last thing I had eaten. Counting was useless. The concept of I slipped away like an ice cube down a gutter. I had the rare, flaying sense of perceiving all of me at once. My childhood, small humiliations, my future, the brief, shining empathy I'd once shown to a stranger, like beads on a thread I could not touch without being burned. It is possible that someone called poison control. It is possible that someone spoke urgently into a phone, and then I heard a word, Datura, that landed in my head like a stone and skipped. I didn't register the syllables as significant at the time. Language was a river I was floundering in. Later I learned that Datura, a plant sometimes used as a hallucinogen, causes delirium and physically dry, hot skin, dilated pupils, and confusion. I was both grateful and ashamed of the knowledge, grateful that there was a name that could be pinned to the chaos, ashamed for the tiny, ridiculous hope that the naming could shrink the horror. When morning tried to establish itself, it did so like a diplomat, cautiously, with a soft, insistent light that refused to be intimidated. The hallmarks of the trip peeled away sluggishly over the next days. My pupils slowly returned to a less alarmed size. My mouth produced saliva in alarming amounts. I almost cried with relief when I could swallow without pain. Sleep did not come easily. When I managed it, the dreams were thick and populated with the shadows that had learned my name. I woke up with the odor of old cardboard clinging to my breath for a week. The aftermath was a kind of violent, slow-motion hangover. Simple tasks became mountainous. Misplaced words. Lost trajectories of sentences mid-thought. There was a tremor inside me, an impatience that felt like a tiny animal gnawing within the ribcage. I revisited the apartment days later, hoping to stitch the broken memory together like a conservator mending a torn painting. The room was the same in all the ways rooms are. Laundry on the chair, a mug on the coffee table, the plant by the window leaning toward the meager sun. But the edges of the experience remained alive in the little betrayals. A cigarette butt that looked like a blackened bone, a mirror that winked when I wasn't looking. Trauma is a geometry of small things that refuse to sit in the space you've designated for them. People asked me the kinds of questions people ask after odd nights. Did you know what it was? Who gave it to you? Why would anyone lace weed with Datura? I had no satisfying answers. The night had been casual. The hand that passed the joint had been steady. I thought about intent like a puzzle. Whether someone had maliciously spiked it, or whether it had been accidental, or whether some chemical cross-contamination had occurred in an ill-kept grinder. None of those explanations eased the tremor in my chest. It became less important to know why and more urgent to know how to live after it. I did things that felt ridiculous and necessary. I Googled. I read medical forums. I argued with doctors about memory gaps and the size of my pupils. I told strangers on the internet the bare facts and got back a messy chorus of empathy and warnings. The medical staff who'd seen me in the fog were precise and matter-of-fact. As if kindness is sometimes a technical act, they told me to hydrate, to rest, to be watchful for lingering cognitive issues. They told me that recovery could be uneven, that it might return as nightmares, that it might never feel entirely clean. That word, uneven, has imprinted itself on me like a brand. You expect after such an experience to be wiser. I hoped for a moral, a clear pivot in my life, but what I found was more prosaic and insidious, small continuing reverberations. For months I would catch a glimpse of a shadow and feel my stomach drop. I began to distrust the communal rituals, passing a joint, sharing a drink, things that had once been seamless expressions of friendship. I avoided certain friends for a while, not out of blame but because proximity itself made me anxious. I felt like a person who'd survived a fire and then kept noticing burnt things in the corners of rooms where there had never been flame. There were, of course, moments of absurdity and gentle humor that helped me stitch myself back together. After a week, I bought a ridiculous, oversized mug with a smiling dinosaur on it. I made tea and laughed at the sight of steam and the normalcy of hot water around a flimsy paper tea bag. My friends, who had been haggard and shaken, slowly reacquired their human edges. Eli brought me a plant with thick leaves, a small green declaration that life persists even in apartments where strange things happen. Maya told me gently and without accusation that she had asked the owner of the joint where it had come from and had been met with a shrug and an apology and a story about a new supplier. Not everyone, she said, watches the ingredient list of their life. The scariest part, in hindsight, was not the hallucination itself, but the way it taught me how fragile the scaffolding of the self is. I had always considered identity a steady procession of choices and memories. Datura dissolved that procession and left me watching my life like a film strip caught in the teeth of a projector. It revealed, with surgical clarity, how much of who we think we are depends on steady neurotransmitters and predictable reflexes, the ability to find a word, to trust a friend to mean what they say, to have the inner light of continuity that reassures you each morning that you are the same person you were the night before. If anything good comes from it, it is the small, brutal gift of humility. I felt, in a way that was almost religious, the thinness of my confidence. I began, slowly and carefully, to practice gentleness, not the syrupy kind, but the practical kind you show a sprained ankle. I paid attention to the labels on things. I learned to ask, always, even if it felt awkward, "What's in this?" I learned to carry water at gatherings, and to sit where exits felt close. I learned to call someone earlier than I had before. Mostly, I learned that fearing the world is different from being afraid in a way that immobilizes you. One is a useful caution, the other an enemy. I still wake sometimes with my mouth parched and the vague impression that the clock hands are melting. Those are the nights when the memory presses up against the inside of my skull and refuses to be turned away. But they are fewer now. Time, mercifully, teaches a kind of forgetting that is not truly erasure, but a reclassifying. Horror put in a drawer with other hard things you survived. The edges dull. The colors fade from raw to sepia. When I tell the story now, people gasp or laugh nervously, or nod in knowing sympathy. Some ask for the lurid details. They want the peak, the moment of vision, and I find I cannot offer a single tidy summit. The experience was a plateau, a long, uneven landscape without a clean crest. You either walked it and remember the rocks underfoot, the strange shrubbery of thought, the sudden, astonishing sky, or you did not. I think that's the truth of most terror. It's less about a single scream than about a long, patient erosion. If you ever find yourself in a room where the smoke tastes like pennies and cardboard, if your mouth goes dry and the world becomes gummy, do not, in any way I can imagine, follow my example. Ask questions. Step outside, hold a friend's hand and say, plainly, "I'm not okay." Trust that the smallest human gestures can be anchors, a warm towel, 2 words, someone staying. It took me a long time to learn that the scaffold of the self is reinforced not only by personal resolve, but by tiny, consistent acts of care performed by other people. There is a scar on my memory that I carry like a pale thread, a reminder that the self is both tougher and more delicate than we think. Sometimes I run my fingers across it, as if to feel that I survived. Sometimes I whisper to it, to myself, that survival is not always a heroic climb, but a slow, stubborn, ordinary thing. A handshake, a glass of water, a plant that refuses to die on the windowsill.